Let us begin with the pasuk of one of the most beautiful verses in the entire Torah, which we have to analyze, is the chapter 19 of Leviticus, verse 14. So I'd like to spend a few moments with you analyzing that by first looking at many of the Gemaras that associate with that, and then we'll look at the interpretation of the Balaturim, Rabbi Soloveitchik, and Lubavitcher Rebbe. Now let's look at what this verse says. Lo sikalel chayresh, do not curse a deaf man, lifnei iver l'titei mechshol, before a blind person. Do not place a stumbling block. V'yaresa milukecha ani Hashem. Well, first of all, I see Sheldon has joined us. That's amazing, Sheldon. I haven't seen you in a minute, and I'm really glad you're back. So Baruch Hashem. Welcome back, Sheldon. It makes my day, makes my whole day. All right, so the verse says, do not curse a deaf person. For a blind person, do not put a stumbling block. And you shall fear Hashem, I am Hashem your God. Now let's first read what Rashi says, and then we'll go to the Gemara. Rashi says, you're not allowed to curse a deaf person. I might think only a deaf person. How do I know you're not allowed to curse anybody? Says the verse. There's a different verse. Parashas Mishpatim. You're not allowed to curse anybody amongst your people. So if that's the case, why does it say a deaf person? To tell us, says the Rashi, to tell us that just like a deaf person is alive, also anyone that's alive. This excludes the dead who are not alive. So you've heard of the idea that people say, I'll never speak bad about the dead, or I'll never curse the dead. Actually, I'm not encouraging anybody to speak bad about the dead, but actually, it's far better to speak bad about the dead than about the living. The living is a violation and a prohibition of the Torah, and that's what it says. You're not allowed to curse anybody who's alive, but there's no prohibition against cursing anyone who's dead. So I notice everybody's much more careful about about criticizing the dead than criticizing those who are alive, and it should be the opposite. The next verse says, before a blind person, do not place a stumbling block. What does that mean, says the Rashi, and we'll see this again when we quote the Gemaros. It means before somebody who is blind in a matter, do not give advice that is not appropriate for him. Do not say to a person, sell me your field and buy a donkey, because you're really just trying to trick him into selling you his field. And so basically you're giving him bad advice. That's like a stumbling block in front of a blind person. So then the verse ends, and you shall fear God, I am Hashem, because both of these matters are really the second matter. Rashi says it's impossible for people to really know what your intent was. You could say, oh, I really thought that the donkeys were going to go way up in price, and that property was going to be a nuisance. I was giving him good advice. So God knows. You should fear God because God recognizes your thoughts. And that's why anything which is handed over to the heart, we say you should fear God because God can read into our hearts. Okay, so now that we've cited this verse with the Rashi, let's look at some of the Talmudic text about this verse, and we'll try to get a deeper understanding. Again, do not curse the deaf, do not place a stumbling block before the blind, and you shall fear God. So first Gemara we go to, hold on one second. Okay. So the Gemara in Sanhedrin 66a says the following: V'chiacheresh levad asur lekalel. Is it only prohibited to curse the deaf? Obviously, it's not the case. Why does it say you shall not curse the deaf? The verse is referring to the diminished amongst your people, meaning to say that there's another verse in the Torah which says you're not allowed to curse the Nasi B'amcha. That's in Exodus chapter 22. It says the prince, or basically the president of your community, you're not allowed to curse. And here, it's saying the Talmud is saying it's referring to let's say the least I don't know if successful is the right word, the least prestigious member of your society. So you have the Torah is going in both directions and saying this prohibition applies both to the people who society perceives as the leader of the society, and it's the one who the society views as being the most degraded member. Meaning to say that you're not allowed to curse either one. You're not allowed to curse the head of the community, and you're not allowed to curse the one who's the opposite. And meaning to say, and what does that mean? Even though, and really I think it applies to both of them, even though neither one is hearing about it. Like if you're sitting there amongst your crew and you just curse the head of the community, nobody hears what you've said. He hasn't heard it. The guy who's the president has not heard it. And also, if you're deciding to curse I saw you raised your hand, Bruce and April, but you took it down, so you're okay. And if you curse the person who's let's say, somebody who everybody else in society steps on, he's not going to hear, and he's not going to be upset. But it's nevertheless, it's teaching us that you're not allowed to curse, that it's less about them, but more about what it does to your soul. And it's a prohibition. And so that's the first text. So basically, you're not allowed to curse anyone who's alive, both the highest, the most impressive, and the least impressive member of the society. It's a prohibition to curse. The Gemara talks about cursing using and Sanhedrin talks about the prohibition is cursing using the name of God. That's the specific prohibition. It doesn't mean like what we call like the words that you're not allowed to use on TV. No, that's not what it's referring to. It's right, using the name of God to curse his people is a violation. And we're going to get to this. The Talmud says in Shavuos, Hamekalas Chavero. So we've seen you're not allowed to curse the most successful, you're not allowed to curse the president, you're not allowed to curse the umlalan, meaning the most downtrodden in your community, and even just your regular friend. That's what the Gemara in Shavuos says. Hamekalas Chavero, when it curses his friend, is in violation of a prohibition, as it says, do not curse the deaf. Okay, so now we go to the next part, which is in many ways much more relevant for all of us. Just something that we deal with a lot. So first we'll start with an expansion of the Rashi. Rashi quoted the case of, I tell this person to buy the donkey, to sell his field and buy a donkey. And that's the first case that we'll see an expansion of that. You're not allowed to place a stumbling block for a blind person. What does that mean? As the Midrash says, the Midrash Halacha, the Torah's Kohanim, it means before somebody was blind in one matter, meaning to say, if he asks advice for you, or if he's taking advice from you, don't give him advice that's not appropriate for him. Don't tell him, oh, you should go out early in the morning because your intent is that this way the robbers will be able to attack him. Or don't say go out in the afternoon so that it gets too hot. Meaning don't give him bad advice. And maybe you'll say, I actually gave him good advice, so that about this. About this, it says, you shall fear God. So Okay. Now we come to the one which is the most relevant. Yes, hello? Okay, so now we come to the one which I think is relevant for all of us every day, and that is Lifnei Iver. This is the prohibition of where it's most applicable. It says, Rabbi Nassan Omer, Rabbi Nassan taught, Minayin shelo yoshit adam kos yayin lenazir. We know a Nazirite is not allowed to drink wine. How do we know a person is not allowed to hand a cup of wine to a Nazirite? The Nazirite's not allowed to drink wine. Nazirite comes into your house and he says, hand me a cup of wine. And how do you know you're not allowed to give it to him? Or let me just say, to make the example more real, let's say you have an alcoholic who comes into your house and it's a sin for him to drink because he's going to basically it's just take him down the wrong path in life. How do you know you're not allowed to pass him a drink? Or how do you know you're not allowed Aver Menachais is ripping the limb off of a living animal to a Noahide? About this, the verse says, Lifnei Iver utitei mechshol. So it says about this, you're not allowed to place a stumbling block before a blind person. So we see from here that it doesn't just mean giving the person bad advice. It also means causing a person to sin, tempting them in a manner. Like, I guess you could call this a little bit like gaslighting today. You know what's going, that's the expression. Like, you know what's going to happen if you give this person the wine. You think that there's a likelihood that this person is going to drink the wine or be tempted. Now, even though we have a concept in the Talmud, ein shaliach l'dvar avera, that you can't be a messenger for sin, meaning to say that if somebody says, go rob the bank for me, and I'll pay you money, and then you go and rob the bank, the person who hired you is not in violation, of the Torah directly, because he has not done the act of robbing the bank. So he's not going to get punished for robbing the bank. But if he gave you the information of how to rob the bank, then he is going to be in violation of this prohibition of placing a stumbling block before the blind person, because he enabled you to sin. And that's the idea of Lifnei Iver. So this is, of course, very relevant because lots of times, you want to do something, with somebody else, and in essence, are you in violation of this sin? I'll give you an example of a question that I had brought, over many times in my rabbinate, because today we're dealing with people. Not everybody is, almost nobody is exactly the same level of religiosity that we individually are, and people we're encountering maybe not as religious and they're or as observant of Jewish law, and they're asking us for what's normal help. So, for example, somebody got a job as in an office, and they're the junior person, and their boss is Jewish, meaning to say they're not that observant of Jewish law. They don't keep kosher. And they say to the junior person, go down to the team and go pick up this food from the restaurant, this non-kosher restaurant where everybody placed their order. So you're basically going back and bringing them the food, the non-kosher food. So this person asked me, is she allowed to go get the food and bring it to them, this non-kosher food? Is this a violation of this prohibition of do not place a stumbling block before a blind person? Anybody know what the answer is to that? So the answer to that is, in that case, I said it was permitted based upon, after I consulted with my teachers and with the sources, because the Gemara in Avodah Zarah 6b discusses this. And it says, when is it prohibited to give the Nazirite the cup of wine? Only when the Nazirite is standing on what's called the dafkim only betray ibre dinara. Only if he's standing, if we're talking about where the Nazarite is standing on the opposite side of a river, and you take your hand over the river and give it to him, so to speak, meaning to say that he could not have gotten that wine on his own. That if you reaching out to him, he wouldn't be able to get it. But if he would be able to get it on his own, and you're just assisting him, then it's not going to be within the prohibition. Now, this doesn't mean you could always do it, but it means when you're in a difficult circumstance, like this person who was in the who was working for that for the person, and if they don't get the food, they're going to lose their job. Then we can rely upon this, and sometimes rely upon it. Let's say you want to encourage people. You're working with people who are finding their way back to traditional Judaism, and they're not there yet, and so you have to engage with them where they are. So sometimes related. If it would be something that they would not be able to do on their own, then you can't encourage them to do it. But if it's something that they would anyways be able to do on their own, then there's much more latitude to be able to do it. So we've seen so far two applications of Lifnei Iver. We've seen one is that you can't give them bad advice, and two, that you can't do something to them that will tempt them into sinning. I want to go to a third one, but first we'll pause. I see. Okay, so now we come to a third application of this principle. And that is from the Gemara in Moed Katan. So the Gemara in Moed Katan says, give me a source from the Torah for the idea that you're supposed to mark a grave. You know, in Judaism, we always mark our graves. So what's the source for this idea that you're supposed to mark our grave or our graves? So Abaye taught, it's based upon this verse. Do not place a stumbling block before the blind person. Meaning to say, if we don't mark the grave, then the Kohen won't know that a dead body is buried there. And then the Kohen will come to walk on the dead body's grave, and he'll become ritually impure. And that's a prohibition for the Kohen. So therefore, if you know of a grave, you're required to proactively mark that grave so that the Kohen does not become tameh. And this is a whole nother level. Now, here, you're not giving the person bad advice. You're not even encouraging this person to sin, but you've created a situation where you're obligated to prevent other people from sinning if it's something that's under your jurisdiction. So this is a third area, meaning to say you have to be proactive in preventing people from sinning. You have to take an aggressive step, and that is by marking the grave that you know of. And so this is almost closer to the concept that you're obligated to, if you see your friend doing something prohibited, you're obligated to try to separate him. Okay, let me just pause for a second. I see you had a question. We continue with some other verses, and this is one of my, this is also another one that's, it's pushes the envelope even more here. The Talmud also in Moed Katan says, I'm going to read the text. Now you have to bear in mind that this text was written 2,000 years ago, and today some of these ideas are taken for granted. But it was written at a time where people routinely hit their children. That was considered an appropriate method of education, and probably some people on this call were raised in a similar manner, that they were struck by either their parents or teachers, and nowadays we would never do that. But it used to be that was normal. But the Talmud already says you should not do it under certain circumstances. Talmud says you're not allowed to place a stumbling block before a blind person. The verse is referring to somebody who strikes their older son, meaning to say that you have to be concerned that if you hit your child, that he will get upset back at you and cause him to violate this sin of not honoring his parents properly. So therefore, for this reason, that's a violation of Lifnei Iver, meaning to say you're not allowed to do something which you're allowed to do. Let's say it used to be the case that parents were not even allowed, but in some cases, the Talmud says you're required to enforce the discipline. So let's just say that it's not even talking about hitting, but it's talking about disciplining, which a parent is obligated, or he needs to discipline his child, or else the child is not going to be raised properly. But if you're going to discipline the child in such a way that they will actually be disrespectful to their parents as a consequence, then this is a violation of Lifnei Iver. So that's obviously a very tricky, very, very tricky position to be in, but that's what the text is saying. That you have to, even if it's something you're allowed to do, this is the fourth level. First, we've said, don't give bad advice. Okay, everybody can agree with that. And then it says, don't give something to somebody which even they're asking for, because that could tempt them to sin. Fine. Then we saw you have to be proactive. If there's something under your control which could cause a person to sin, you have to be proactive to prevent it. But now we're saying, don't even do something which you're required to do by law, if as a consequence of your action, the person will commit a greater sin. Because meaning say you're required to discipline, but if because you discipline, this person will double down on their bad behavior, then you're not even allowed to do that. And that is a whole nother level of limitation on your actions, meaning you have to anticipate what are the consequences of your action. If it's a consequence of your action, this person will sin, then you're not allowed to do that. So the Gemara gives an example of this based upon the Gemara in Kedoshim 32a. And what was the story? The story there was, hold on one second. Hold on. The story was that Rav Huna tore his garment in front of his his son Rabbah, and he said, "I want to see if my son will get upset or not." And he wants to see if I'll cause my son to get upset and stop me. And the Gemara says, but maybe the son will get upset and it'll be in violation of Lifnei Iver. So the Gemara's answer is no, that the father basically waived. He had anticipated this problem and he said, I waive my honor in this specific case. But we see that this is an example of, are you allowed to provoke somebody, say something which you know will cause the person to get upset, and then have a crazy reaction? Like, let's say, a person is a crazy Republican or a crazy Democrat, and you go into them in front of a crowded room and you bait them into like going nuts with their, you know how to push somebody's buttons. Let's just say that. So you have to be careful not to do that. That's a violation of this. Okay. I'll give you one more example from the Talmud of this, and this is actually this is another level of extreme. This is based upon the Gemara in Bava Metzia 75b. The Gemara in Bava Metzia 75b says, whoever lends money, whoever lends money without witnesses is in violation of Lifnei Iver Lotite Mechshol. If you lend money without witnesses, then you're in violation of this prohibition. Because now you've created the possibility for this person to deny the loan. This is a whole nother level of extreme, that you're not giving him bad advice, you're not helping him sin, you're not even creating a situation where he can sin, you're not even doing anything harsh to him, you're doing him a favor. And you're saying, I trust you, I trust you, I trust you. But you've created the possibility for him to deny this loan because there's no witnesses, and therefore there's a violation. That's a violation of this prohibition. Okay, so anyway, this is. Let me just say one more thing. I said that was the last one, but I want to just show one more distinction, which is important for this. This is from the Gemara in Avodah Zarah 14a. The Gemara says that Abaye taught that now we have a limitation on the law. Finally, we've seen all these expansions of the verse. Now we have one limitation. One limitation comes from Abaye. Abaye says, Lifnei Iver, we're careful about that. Alifnei mafkidin, or makpidin, it should really be. On Lifnei Iver, we don't allow you to do. But Lifnei du Lifnei, lo makpidin. Meaning to say, before a blind person, you're not allowed to do it. But before, if it's attenuated, so it's too removed, then you'd be allowed to do it. So that would be something. What's the example of this in the Gemara? That you're not allowed to sell to an idolater something that they're going to use for their holidays on the eve of their holiday. Like, let's assume that this idolatry worships a certain type of tree, and you have this tree, you know how to sell to them on the eve of the holiday because then you're allowing them or encouraging them to worship. But if you know that you're selling it to a person who doesn't need it, who's not going to use it directly, but then that other person might sell it to another person, basically through a middle person, that's not going to be a violation. That you'd be allowed to. There's a question whether or not we say that this doesn't apply the attenuated situation we were talking about only between a Jew and a non-Jew, but if it's between a Jew and a Jew, it should still apply. Okay, but we'll take up that question for another time. In the meantime, I want to share what Rabbi Soloveitchik says and what the Lubavitcher Rebbe says. But first of all, we've been talking about, this is one of my favorite aspects of this law. We've been talking about this law that you're not going to place a stumbling block before a blind person. We've been expanding it, that it applies even about sin, about advice, even creating the situation, even you have to do an act of a proactive act. What about the actual situation described in the verse? Actually placing a stumbling block before a blind person. Is that actually included within the prohibition? Is that actually included? So here I want to turn to Rabbi Soloveitchik, who discusses it. And he points out that according to the Sefer HaChinuch, the Sefer HaChinuch is the classic 14th century work, written anonymously, even though some people now claim they know who it is, but fine. The Sefer HaChinuch writes that if you place a stumbling block before a blind person, it's not a good thing that you're doing. You're not doing anything good, but you don't get lashes for it because there's no action associated with it. And so therefore, Meaning to say, the Sefer HaChinuch is basically saying that is not fit within the prohibition of Lifnei Iver. So this is the tremendous rabbinic irony, that the prohibition of placing a stumbling block before a blind person, according to the rabbis, only means giving them bad advice or encouraging them to sin, but not physically placing a stumbling block before a blind person. Only the rabbis could read the verse and get to that conclusion. So that's the question Rabbi Soloveitchik asks. He asked the question, how could it be that we have a concept, the verse should not leave its literal meaning? So how could it be that actually placing a stumbling block before a blind person is not included within the prohibition of do not place a stumbling block before a blind person? Anybody want to try to answer that question? So I see that nobody's going to take a shot at it, so I'll tell you what Rabbi Soloveitchik says. He says that his answer is that the act of placing an actual stumbling block before a blind person is so cruel, is so grotesque, that the Torah didn't even think it's worthy to mention. Because for a Jew to act in that manner, we would question their very Jewishness. We would say such a person can't even Jewish. And since the Torah is addressing the Jewish people exclusively, therefore the Torah felt it was such an outrageous thing, such a prohibition that was unnecessary. But it's a little difficult to me to accept that answer, because the Torah often mentions things that are so cruel and grotesque, and yet the Torah still mentions it. But Soloveitchik gives an example from the verse in Psalms, Habotzea Beireich Ni'etz Hashem. There's one who praises a compromiser is actually insulting God. And the Gemara's explanation of this is that when Aaron saw that Hur slaughtered, basically before the golden calf happened, they came to Aaron and Hur objected. Hur was Aaron's nephew, and he objected. And so Aaron thought to himself that if he also refused, people would come as well, and therefore never be forgiven. So Aaron said, it's better to make the golden calf, and God will possibly forgive the sin, rather than kill him with no such possibility. So the Talmud is saying that clearly Aaron did not act properly. He should have allowed himself to be killed, says Rabbi Soloveitchik, rather than agree to the people's request. So by extension, we learn from here that before one violates this prohibition of Lifnei Iver as it relates to idolatry, one should even give up their life. So that's so this concept of Lifnei Iver is so severe that you shouldn't, if you're going to cause somebody to violate this one of the three sins, like the three cardinal sins of idolatry, adultery, and murder, and you are going to assist them in such a manner as it's a violation of Lifnei Iver, therefore it will be a tremendous violation, and Rabbi Soloveitchik argues you should even give up your life. So this is typical of Rabbi Soloveitchik in that he takes a legalistic approach to it, but I wanted to also take the Rebbe's approach, and we'll see what the Rebbe says, and you'll see it's also typical of the Rebbe's approach. But let's see what Sheldon has to say, of course. Sheldon. Okay, let's see what the Rebbe says about this. And the Rebbe writes as follows. Again, the Rebbe focuses on the commentary of Rashi, which is you're not allowed to give sound advice with ulterior motives. So he reads it differently than the way I had read it. I read it that you're not allowed to give bad advice. And you're not allowed to tell the person to sell his field and buy a donkey. I read it that you're not allowed to give bad advice. But the Rebbe reads it differently. The Rebbe says the verse forbids giving sound advice with ulterior motives, meaning even if it's good advice, if your motives are not pure, you're not allowed to give such advice. For example, writes the Rebbe, we cannot tell a naive person to sell his field and buy a donkey so that we can then buy his field. Even if this advice is actually advantageous for the blind person, it is still prohibited on account of the motivation of the advisor. See, this is the Rebbe. This is the Rebbe. The Rebbe is saying you can't give a person good advice, even good advice, if you have ulterior motives. That's the Rebbe's argument. And let me just finish this sentence before we take the question. The Rebbe writes, the Torah here teaches that the proper approach towards helping others, in order to optimally benefit another person, we must rid ourselves of any self-oriented motivation, focusing instead solely on the needs of the other person. The Rebbe has, this is a powerful reading by the Rebbe, a very, very, very powerful reading. That if you have any benefit from the advice, you can offer it, because if you really want to help them, you have to get rid of any self-oriented motivation. Now, this is something I'll expand on in a moment, but let's first pause. What I think of course, the verse is referring to buying and selling, but the Rebbe was talking to his shluchim, and he said this in the Likutei Sichos, and he says something which I think he knows his Chabad shluchim, and I think what he's saying is as follows. That they have this here in one of the Rebbe's chumashim. I have two different chumashim that are collected from the Rebbe, and it says here the last word. The lesson from the above is clear. Helping another Jew who is on the quote-unquote path of return should not be done for the motive of personal gain. Rather, one should help another even when it involves physical or spiritual loss. And it's precisely this approach which meets with the approval of the sages. So basically, if the Rebbe is saying to his students who are involved in bringing people closer to the faith, that you shouldn't be done for the purposes of your motivation, should not be for the purposes of helping your own community, meaning say like bring this person closer to the faith, and that way he's going to, basically provide help for your community. That should not be at all your motivation, and that maybe would be a violation of Lifnei Iver. So you can imagine a situation where he says to his community, I want you to start observing Shabbos, because he knows that if this person starts observing Shabbos, then it's going to be very beneficial to his community that he's trying to build. Rather, it should only be even when it involves physical or spiritual loss, meaning to say even when it adversely affects your community, there should be no motivation of personal gain. That the Rebbe was telling his shluchim, remove any personal gain from the equation completely, and that's the way you should look at it when you're helping people. So this is obviously, I think, very different than the case of somebody who hires somebody to manage their money for them, which is clearly the whole purpose of the relationship. So I think that's a distinction that works. Okay, so let's just summarize what we've said, and then we'll stand down. We said, do not place a stumbling block before a blind person. This could refer, on the one hand, we saw to giving bad advice that benefits you. It also, we said, in addition to giving bad advice that benefits you, it also, hold on one second. It also relates to the area of causing somebody else to sin, like tempting them into sin. It also relates to the idea of proactively preventing people from sin by marking graves. It also relates to not putting somebody in a situation, even if you're allowed to do it by disciplining them, which you eventually will cause them to sin. And also it relates to this idea of it relates to the idea of not having any ulterior motive, even if it's to their benefit. That's what the Rebbe says. Rabbi Soloveitchik said, let's also remember that it actually literally does not apply, but that's because it's so grotesque that it doesn't even need to be said. But that's a little bit of a challenging explanation for me that I'm a little puzzled about. But anyway, this is just this one verse before a blind person do not place a stumbling block. All right, we'll stop here. If anybody has any questions, happy to address.